Okay, this is the wise and the foolish builders. I'm reading from Luke 6, starting with verse 46. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you? Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and does them, I will show you what he is like. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid a foundation upon rock. And when a flood arose, the stream broke against the house and could not shake it, because it had been well built. But he who hears and does not do them is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation, against which the stream broke, and immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great. Okay, a couple things about this. First of all, let's look at the context. In Matthew, a major portion of the book of a major piece in the book of Matthew, of course, is the Sermon on the Mount. It covers chapters 5 through 7. It's 3 chapters. It's one of our major sources of inspiration. It is so elegant. Begins with, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God." So this parable in the Matthew version, starting with Matthew 7:24, ends it. It's the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount. Now, there is also in Luke a shorter passage called the Sermon on the Plain. It's different, but it's the same. Instead of "blessed are the poor in spirit," Luke says, "Blessed are the poor, for theirs shall be the kingdom of God." But so we have this is the conclusion of both of them. Matthew, there is in the saying what he ends with is when Jesus had finished these sayings. That's Matthew 7:28. That's the end, the very end of the. That's where he transitions. That Matthew 7:28, when Jesus had finished these sayings, appears also in a similar form in Matthew 11, 13, 19, and 26. And each one is followed by a new kind of topic. So it's so after what follows after this in 28 and 29 is when Jesus had finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. So you have 5 sections in Matthew, and that is, scholars like to believe this follows the Pentateuch. And this particular one, the Sermon on the Sermon on the Mount, actually redefines the law. But at any rate, these are the ends of the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain. Building is a common theme in the Old Testament and the New. It occurs in reference hundreds of times in the Bible, literally, figuratively, and metaphorically. Now, this is a metaphor here, but it's very common, and no, it's no wonder. For building is what makes cities and villages and homes, and people are doing it all the time. Mm-hmm. I went to a movie last night, No Other Land, powerful movie, in which people's homes kept being demolished and they kept rebuilding them. So this notion of building is very, very common in the in the Old and the New Testament. And it's also a common factor in Rome. Do you recall last year where they had this terrible earthquake in Turkey, and Antikia, which is ancient Antioch, was basically decimated by this earthquake because they didn't have good building codes. Right. Well, imagine cities in the ancient world, and particularly very dense cities like Rome. Most people in Rome lived in tenements. And these are tenements with no running water and they're just buildings, just blocks. And sometimes they would go 5 stories high. And they collapsed frequently. Oh. They just didn't have the technology to build and reinforce a building. But when you tried to make it high, that's what you have to do if you have a very dense population. And we see also a citation in the Gospels. Consider this, Luke 13:4. Consider those 18 people. Consider those 18 people who were killed when the Tower of Siloam fell on them. Do you think they were more guilty than anyone else who lived in Jerusalem? So we know that in one particular case, a tower fell, and probably just because of the technology. They built it too high for their building materials and their architectural skills. So it's a common metaphor. Here, I want to read to you from Ezekiel 33. This notion of people not listening is powerfully stated in the in a passage in Ezekiel 33, starting in verse 30. As for you, son of man, your people who talk together about you by the walls and at the doors of the houses, say to one another, each to his brother, come and hear the word as it comes forth from the Lord. And they come to you as people come, and they sit before you as my people, and they hear what you say, but they will not do it. For with their lips they show much love, but their heart is set on their gain. And lo, you are like to them, like one who sings love songs with a beautiful voice and plays well on an instrument, for they hear what you say, but they will not do it. When this comes, and come it will, they will know that a prophet has been among them. The picture there is where everybody goes to listen to the prophetess who may have sung. Prophecies could easily have been sung, and they go to the prophet and as a form of entertainment, not as a form of inspiration. And that's kind of what Jesus is suggesting here. This is not entertainment, folks. And he says, the times are coming. Okay. And I want to read to you from Proverbs 7:28, from Matthew 16:18. And I will tell you, Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the powers of death shall not prevail. Here's this notion of rock as something very, very solid. And this is what you're supposed to build your faith on the rock. In the Sermon on the Plain in Luke, we see he's starting off by saying, why do you call me Lord, Lord? And do not do what I tell you. This term Lord, Lord is not uncommon in the Old Testament, because you will recall that the Jews do not like to use the term Yahweh. And so frequently in the Old Testament, you read Yahweh Adonai, where they would, when they were reading it, the Bible out loud, they would say Adonai rather than Yahweh. So what you get in translation in the Greek is Lord, Lord. So this is just for your information. Okay, any questions? You got it, folks.
Could I ask a quick side question?
Yeah, of course.
Why didn't the Jews want to say Yahweh?
Okay,
Is it too sacred?
Yes.
You need, and you shouldn't.
you should say, it's the divine Yahweh. We don't know how it's actually pronounced.
Yeah.
The King James Version has Jehovah. And it comes from Moses on the Mount. And Moses asked God with fire, who shall I say is telling me? And he says, I am that I am. It's a form of the verb to be. And it says, I am that I am. And the problem is that in Hebrew, they don't have vowels originally. So it's YHWH. That's what it reads in Hebrew. We don't know what that says because in the Hebrew, later, much after it was written, the Hebrew scholars did what they call pointed. And this was done very late, actually, in 500 or so AD, where they put the letters underneath it, inside it and underneath it. And they inserted the vowels of the verb of the name Adonai into Yahweh, YHWH. So, and when you try to pronounce it, it sounds like Jehovah if you're German, because they don't have Y's in German, or Yahweh in more common words. Yes.
And I think of Richard Rohr, I think it was, it wrote one time, Yahweh
Yeah.
sounds like our first breath.
Yes.
And it sounds like,
Yes.
yeah, and it's one we share
Yeah.
together.
Yeah.
Isn't that neat?
Yes. Yes. Richard Rohr's got a lot of good stuff. Okay, folks. So what do you think?
So. Yes, I think something. For me, I actually did homework this time and I actually read the stuff before the scripture. And for me, it's really interesting that right before the two builders, and you mentioned this, in the Lord part, he's saying, so not everyone will get into heaven, but people will say, in your name we spoke God's message. That sounds like something that is a good thing, right? In your name we drove out demons. That sounds like a good thing. And performed miracles. That also sounds like a good thing. So clearly what you're doing, even if you're doing good things, that's still not a house on the rock, apparently. That's my question. So if you look at verse 21 through 23, right before the two house builders, Not everyone who calls me Lord will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only those who do what my Father in heaven wants them to do.
Oh, in Matthew, you're in Matthew.
Oh, I'm in Matthew. Are you doing mostly Luke?
Matthew and Luke, they're in parallel.
Yeah.
It just read Luke.
Okay, I'm in Matthew. Okay.
So I wonder if there's the same kind of thing in.
Oh, good question.
That's where.
But, so the do, for me, that introduces a question because the doing. Well, in that case. It must not be what. My Father in heaven wants them to do. I don't know, it's very confusing to me, that passage.
Ask him again, maybe. I think
It may be that these two being at the end of the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain recast a little bit what the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain are all about. We like to say they are very, very inspiring, but they're also a warning, huh? And we get this horrible problem is what are they warning against?
Right, that seems to be a question, huh?
Well, that's, once again, we've broached our least favorite topic, which is judgment.
Yeah.
That we will be held accountable.
But which, even if we hate that, still, what we could say is, I think verse 22 is saying, maybe you don't want to, on Judgment Day, you don't want to come up and say, look at everything I did. Boy, was I great. I did this, I did that. Maybe that's the issue.
It's the verses just before.
Right, just before, verse 22 of Matthew. But in Matthew, right before the two house builders,
Matthew,
yeah,
22.
Matthew 22.
just right beforehand. I mean, it's sort of the setup for one of the setups,
Matthew 7:22.
yeah.
Are you saying that there is contradiction?
That's what I'm wondering,
Yeah.
that's a hard thing I'm wondering about that, right?
Oh.
Cause I don't think it's really contradiction, it's just making me wonder what it means to. So it sounds like maybe that's not what,
7:22. This is the end of the Sermon on the Mount. I got 22:17, sorry. Matthew.
Matthew 7.
Yeah. Now, this is the
Yeah.
end of the Sermon on the Mount right here. And when Jesus finished these words, they were astonished at his teaching. And because he taught as somebody having authority, not as their scribes. And this is the 7:21 says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not drive out demons in your name? Did we not do mighty deeds in your name? Then I will declare to them solemnly, I never knew you. Depart from me, you evildoers. That's how the Sermon on the Mount ends, folks. And it's not pretty.
So what do you think that means?
What do you think it means? You tell me.
Well, that's what, maybe it doesn't matter, maybe no one else cares, I'm just curious.
Well, prior to that, the tree and its fruit, if it's a good tree, it's gonna have good fruit, you know a tree by itself. You sort of saying, I think the sort of the parenthesis, or there's this section that you're worried about is flanked by, you will know a good tree by its fruit, and you will know a bad tree by its fruit, or its horrible fruit. And then
these people are sort of bragging about what.
yeah, I think it's people who are putting on a show, and he would
Yeah,
you know, he's kind of thinking on what's down to bedrock.
that's probably the critical
And
point.
he's kind of recasting the Pentateuch and saying it's kind of, I think you might be saying it's been, the law has been misappropriated and misapplied,
Mhm.
trying to offer corrective and sort of saying that when you're really getting down to what my father says, then you'll have good fruit and then
Right,
those.
that's
fruits will
really
be
good.
pushed up. That's the way I think. about
That's good. Yeah, that is very helpful. Yep, yep.
There are building codes, there are regulations. Some are kind of sloppy and people build communities on floodplains. And they don't last long. And
Yeah,
then you try to rebuild again,
yeah,
same place.
Mhm.
persistence of, sometimes we can persist in our own error, can't we?
After Katrina, I asked a friend who was a banker, what will they do with all of that, those homes that people lived in that were destroyed? And he said, you can't rebuild slums.
Which means,
Which means you can't rebuild slums, but people do.
oh, even though you shouldn't, is the implication.
Well, look at Pacific Palisades.
Yeah.
As horrible as that is. You know, the rains are coming and the mud's coming down. I mean, how do you fix that?
Yeah.
Oh, it's hard to build on solid ground. Lives too.
Mm.
Are you asking why we do that?
Why?
Yeah, is that what you're asking?
Why why do we keep having wars? Why do we keep doing what we do? I'm tired of it. Well, how do you stop?
Go
Well,
back
if-
to the Garden of
If
Eden.
Katrina tore down your house, and I was with a group of people down there that did tear a house down. The owner still owned the lot. You get rid of the debris if you can, wherever. And you still have that lot, that's yours, and you're probably still paying taxes on it. So you're hopeful that you can rebuild something, again, that might be a little stronger.
Might be stronger.
Mm.
It might accommodate what could happen next, another hurricane, like a house in Pacific Palisades that is made of fireproof material. I don't know, I mean, I think that's a cool metaphor.
Mhm.
You can't totally move out of Mississippi, even though there will be more Katrinas coming on. There's even with climate change, more and more of those kinds of storms. But where else can you go?
Well, where else do we go? I mean, think, Ron, when we're here. Right, this is who we are, this is our life. So how do we move away from that? We have to face what we have and build on it. Right, I mean, hope for this.
And hoping for the best sometimes doesn't feel like enough.
And sometimes it isn't.
And sometimes it isn't, right. And maybe that's what the end is. Then I say to you, I never knew you'd get away from me, you were good people like you guys. You got it wrong. Losers. It's not, yeah, it's not working because. Well, we all fell from grace for one thing, so.
It's interesting, it seems to me, and we're having this problem all over the country now. We have down in Florida, we got hurricanes, they got Katrina down in the Louisiana and Mississippi. We got rains and wildfires in California, and homes are sliding into the sea. And it looks like the only thing that may stop this is the cost of insurance.
You mean stop the building
Yeah.
on these precarious places?
People will pay, people will pay a lot
Yeah,
out of, because they want to be in a particular place.
yeah.
And sometimes they don't pay much attention to wisdom.
Yeah,
It's where their heart is, where they just feel their sense of being, because they're not gonna let anything take it away, because it's their church.
Yep.
And it's where they wanna be. And they will rebuild. Well, after Katrina, I was down there also, and they built those houses of stilts, Brad Pitt, and all that time, energy on buildings. Because those people wanted that piece of property, that lot, where their livelihood is. That's why.
I think some people do it because they have no choice. They do not see a choice. It doesn't have, it may or may not have to do with how they feel about the land. It's just they don't know, they don't know what else to do. It seems, from that point perspective, it seems kind of harsh to say, go ahead and try it, and it's not gonna work. What do you say to somebody that has no choice?
That's,
Yeah,
you're talking right now, are you speaking sort of metaphorically when you're saying
I
that?
know I'm talking
Real,
real
okay.
today.
Mhm.
frequently, particularly in urban areas, the lowlands are the slum areas. Now, isn't it interesting? So people build on the hill. Well, hurricanes don't care about hills, nor do earthquakes, and nor do the rains and the slides. Somehow, judgment catches up with us, doesn't it?
He who hears and does not do them is like. But what is it that we hear and do not do in other circumstances of our life?
Thank you. That's,
What do you think, is that what you think Jesus is saying here in this parable?
I think so.
okay.
And do you think he sees it as a problem,
I'm paying attention.
not paying attention?
That's the one we're talking
Get
about.
us into a whole lot of.
Yeah,
Innocent.
yeah.
Sometimes you feels like you just want to take people and shake them. Listen up.
Yeah, but that's kind of judgy.
It is kind of judgy, isn't it? It is.
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
Come to you complaining.
No, well, even now.
Yeah, you're
Well,
right,
yes.
good, I mean,
You listen to them.
That's
and you
interesting.
maybe kindly show them options or ask them to think of options besides what they're currently doing that is not working.
well, that's also good.
I had an old professor who would always say, you don't have to believe that hell is a place that you go to. Hell is the place that you make for yourself when you don't follow the rules. And you live in hell when you don't follow God's
Well,
rules.
Yeah,
And I think about that all the time. When I see the mess that people have made of their lives, and you think, maybe the mess I've made of my own life, I think so much. Well,
Yeah.
you know, but, well, yeah, I don't have to think that judgment is coming. Judgment is here when you don't build upon the foundation and your house is off
Yes.
in the ocean, because, but it's so not, but it's such a, my heart feels like it's here. If you follow your own whims and emotions, what, are you really seeking?
Yeah.
God?
and I think that these rules are not only the law, but wisdom, the whole wisdom tradition. This comes from the wisdom kind of literature here. This is, it's stupid to build your house on sand, but people do it anyway, and that's the kind of wisdom that we all listen to.
mhm.
Church is the rock. Most people that don't go to church are all, they're the ones that have to worry, because they're not building their lives around God.
But even sometimes people who go to church,
Well, maybe, actually, maybe that's what you're just saying, those are the people who are saying, hey, look, I spoke God's message in your name, and I did this, and I did that. I mean, if you go to
That's-
church, it's pretty easy to say
That's
that.
right there in the Sermon on the Mount.
Right.
See, we like to think of the Sermon on the Mount in terms of the Beatitudes. When you get to the end of it, it gets a little more dicey.
Judgy.
Judgy.
Yeah.
And
I will say excuses though, you know, I mean, well, I did everything I could, I was nice, I contributed to mission, I signed up to do the house build, and look what happened. My life is a wreck. So is that an excuse? Is that an excuse maybe, that I couldn't build that house there because I didn't own the land, he owned the land, I don't.
Yeah.
Are those excuses? Or maybe that's what Jesus was saying, don't go for the excuse. Own it.
I think Jesus keeps telling us, go for grace.
and obey me, and go for grace, and obey,
Of course.
me, right? So I mean.
I mean, our problem is that when we build our nice big house on sand, we think we've built something.
And for some reason, it's always easiest for us to find the problems in the way other people have built their homes and where they built their homes. We're just back from a couple weeks in Florida, and the people that we met down there, locals, were genuinely unbelieving of the fact that we could live in Michigan. They didn't have those cold temperatures that kill people. They didn't have those tornadoes all the time. How in the world can you live up there?
Oh,
Well, I won't point fingers at your hurricanes or at the people who live in California on all of that mud and deal with the fires all the time. There are other people rightly concerned about my decision about where I built my house.
That's right.
So I think we're all in the same boat, is what I'm.
Yeah.
It's the human boat.
I think the boat that Jesus is talking about is that people have a choice. Christ has laid out in the Sermon on the Mount what these, what he's saying is a better way, but you can choose to go another way. You can build your house wherever you want to, but know there's consequences if you do. So it's,
also,
I don't know whether the house has some special identity here, or it's just a way to illustrate the example, so.
There's another metaphor, and Ed, you taught us to that when we had Ecclesiastes. Chasing after the wind, I think is the metaphor. That fits the same thing as this.
it is interesting that all of this, just going on what you just said, all of this is also in the context of having just heard about, you know, the speck in the log in your own eye,
Oh, yeah.
right? I mean, that comes in chapter 7 as well.
Right,
Quit looking for that speck, which is sort of saying, look at all those stupid people building on the sand.
right.
That's sort of.
When you
Isn't
have
it?
a log in your own eye.
Right? Well,
And
it
so,
feels that
yeah,
way.
it does feel that way.
I think you were sort of
hypocrite.
saying that, right?
You hypocrite.
Right.
First take the log out of your own eye. So
Yeah,
I think we're all being admonished
Yeah.
to
look at ourselves.
look at ourselves. Yeah,
Not at the other people,
yeah.
maybe.
Woe is me, for I am undone.
Yeah,
I live in the midst of an evil people. I think that's how it goes.
Which one is that? Is that Isaiah? Or is that Isaiah?
Woe is me. Yeah, that sounds like Isaiah.
I like the one that it says, I believe, help me in my unbelief. I love that.
I do too.
That's me.
Me too.
As Ed has pointed out so many times, you know, the description here of what's coming, the floods and the rain, the turmoil, that's predicted. It's there in this passage, again, that we will be challenged he will be put to the test.
Oh, man.
Life's not easy, you think? You think that Jesus is saying that?
We'll be prepared.
Yeah,
Be prepared.
It's gonna come, be prepared. And I've shown you the answer.
Over and over, right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, he's lived it too. He's lived it, which makes it real, which makes him real. And you can, you can identify with that.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of Christ.
I don't have problems with people who are the heads of the world, like us. Who have choices and they can make them. There are still people that don't have the choices,
Right, well, that's so true.
and that's where the grace comes.
Yeah.
Georgia, what'd you say? I didn't hear.
That's what, well, there are people that do not have choices.
Yes.
And that's where grace comes in, for those people. How they can survive, thinking, how can I live in a world like this? Where is God in this whole thing? If they have stability there, then they hopefully can make it through. And not give up, and but they can continue to try, continue to believe that God is with them.
That's such a compassionate. Isn't that compassionate?
Yeah, and I have trouble with this because we tend to think that Jesus is so nice. He did everything so nice with people. And we don't really like to think about all this tough stuff that he was talking about.
Mhm.
And it's giving me a whole different look at who I think Jesus was and was doing. And that's a lot of work.
He was
Well, you know. Good, and that was the essence. Yeah, doing all the kinds he could. And that was the sum total of my understanding of Jesus as a little girl.
Right.
And if I don't carry on any further than that, it's only part of the picture.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's often places where you feel like, oh, man, I wish he didn't say that.
Right, right.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
no, that doesn't fit quite the image.
Right, right, but we have to remember that reality he was dealing with. Oh, it must have been terrible.
I'd like to flag a smaller point that has to do with language that appears in both of these passages. And it has to do with the words do and does.
say that again.
It has to do with the words do and does. And it says, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them.
Mhm.
And the next, on the other passage, it says, but he who hears and does not do them, which is sort of not usually how we would, not usually the verb that we would use. I think that it's easy to think of that as believes them, but I think we're being asked to do more than believe, but to act on them. And that's what do and does here. There's no sense of complacency here. You've got to figure out actions to take.
But
that relate to
are you thinking that do and does are different? Are you?
No.
Oh, thank you. Okay, good. Okay. Sure, yeah.
Let me check that out. Give me a second here.
Mhm.
Well, it makes me want to go back over what Jesus said leading up to this.
I
It's
agree.
in terms of what
What does he say to do?
did we hear?
Yep.
From Jesus, these words of mine,
I agree.
you know, that's so critical. And that's,
And which ones are you pointing to at the moment? All of them.
yes, what came
Yeah.
before, what Jesus
Yeah.
said before this passage.
Yeah,
The things that he said we were to do.
Right.
yeah.
Well, here's these words of mine. It feels like we need to hear them.
Yes, it puts a new urgency on listening to what Jesus said.
I agree. I agree.
And then do something about
Yeah.
it. That's the second part. Hear and do both.
Yeah, I think you're right. It feels,
Isn't it terribly frustrating to be a minister? Frustrating to be a minister. You preach a sermon and you know what you're talking about and you know these people are maybe even listening, but they're not gonna go, they're not gonna change. Isn't that frustrating?
Well, most of my ministry was listening rather than preaching
Okay,
as a chaplain.
oh, okay.
I would witness, I wouldn't necessarily preach.
Although we heard you do some very good preaching.
But Ed,
Be the
you
church.
preached.
Ed.
Pardon me,
You preach.
Yeah.
You
I don't
preached,
preach very often these days.
But you did.
Oh, yeah,
Was it frustrating?
yeah. Thing about preaching is you get to stand up and nobody gets to talk back.
Well, I did preach one. Well, no, several times, but I did on the Good Samaritan. And the lawyer asked, who's my neighbor? And I dared to use a contemporary situation of a judge ordering cross district busing in Detroit and Grosse Pointe, and I was preaching in Grosse Pointe. And I was challenged on that. I think you're full of beans, chaplain, pastor, that's what he said. So you take a risk.
Yeah.
When you step into, what does this mean for us in this cultural situation right now? And it didn't feel very good.
Right.
You get blowback when.
Yeah, you do get blowback. One of the more enlightening things is standing out there shaking people's hand after a sermon. And sometimes people will say, I really liked it when you said X, but I never said X.
Hysterical.
That happened a lot.
There you go. That just
See,
illustrative of this passage.
what, the thing, we Presbyterians insist that all ministers have studied Greek and Hebrew.
Right.
And that this is very unpopular amongst students, particularly Hebrew. Hebrew, you gotta reframe your mind entirely. You gotta read backwards and all this kind of stuff. And there are not so many cognates in Hebrew. There are some. So it's, and the grammar is very unusual. So, and one of the things I learned as a preacher is that, look, you know, I could stand up and preach. But I'm the only one up there, only one in the congregation ordinarily, not always. I had a small church, who could read the Greek and Hebrew. I'm not a Greek or Hebrew scholar, but I can read it and study it if I have to. That just gives me enormous advantage.
Yeah, for sure.
It really is. And for all those students who complain about it, and all those people complain about it, I said, look, you know, your authority is minimal. The authority, you know, and the fact that you can stand up and say, this is what the Bible says, and it says it in Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic and all that kind of stuff. And that gives you a huge advantage. So it's no small thing as a preacher to have that kind of advantage. Now, many pastors don't, most, I think we may be we're certainly one of the very few denominations that still requires Greek and Hebrew. Pardon me? Lutherans do, yeah.
It seems like you have to require it,
No, you don't,
you know?
you don't have to do anything.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it would be useful to require it.
Absolutely useful. So. Okay, it's a little early. Anything else we want to talk about? We got to keep going. Are we ready to finish or we want to keep going?
Let's keep going.
Let's keep going. Okay, got it.
Hey, Dad, did you know Latin? Do you know Latin too?
Only from high school. Yeah,
Hey, high school,
I took high school Latin and I used a pony a lot.
So we run the risk of only taking a scripture, you know, like a verse, and making it be the whole thing.
Yes,
And
we do.
so when you talk about context, so when you guys read 22 before 24, and then the Sermon on the Mount before that. And so when people take Bible passages and just shorten them up and put their own, that's dangerous.
I hope, I pray that if you folks take anything from this class, it's that you gotta look at the larger context.
It's such a huge responsibility.
It is, and particularly since when it gets complicated, people get lost. I know that. I've led you down a few garden paths in my time, because it does get complicated. But you gotta try. The fact that you don't know Greek or Hebrew or Aramaic, that's okay these days for two reasons. One is that you have all these different translations. And by comparing them, you can see where the gist of it, where it tends to go. And you can also, you can select a particular translation that you find is very accurate. You can buy Bibles, particularly New Testaments, that have 5 or 6 versions in parallel. That happened a long time ago. One of our earliest translations of the Bible is the Bible in parallel columns with Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, and all these different versions of it. Because people realized early on, we Christians realized early on that it's not enough just to read one person's interpretation, which is what a translation is.
So, just to follow up on that, Peggy, I have two reactions. One is a yes, and in our worship service every week, we take some tiny little passage and oftentimes skip verses. And there's no context at all, and half the time, no one even talks about it. They talk about some other story, you know, which really, I mean, problematic apparently. But then the other, let's see, I had one other comment, but I guess I'll leave it at that, 'cause I can't remember the other one.
One of the disciplines this church does is preaches from the lectionary.
Yeah,
And the lectionary is a 3-year cycle in which you technically get the whole Bible.
right.
Except now and then you'll come up and the passage for the day is such and such, and it skips from this verse down to this verse. And the Bible's too big to put it in 3-year to get everything. I have on occasion preached from the verses that were not included.
Hmm.
And sometimes what's left out is more important than what's.
Yeah, I think that what bothers me is that that practice does not speak to the point that you have been trying to make, and that feels very important to you, which is if we're gonna take anything away from this class, please take away that it's very important to put things into context,
Yeah.
into scriptural context, right? And we don't even do that in our worship service,
Well,
but the other. the
good
other-
preachers do.
Yeah, true enough. But then the other one was, occasionally, it seems like there are verses you can take out of context, where it's, you know, there are bits of wisdom,
Right, love thy neighbor as thyself, I mean, right, you, everyone
do you
understands
need
it.
that to be
Yeah.
in a context?
Yeah.
Probably you could put that in any context and it would be worthwhile.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Did you say what a copy?
Oh, I just said love thy neighbor as thyself, for example, that's,
that's something that you don't have to
Yeah.
necessarily see.
the whole context, you can,
But maybe you'd get more out of it if you saw the context.
yeah,
Right.
true, and then applied it to yourself.
When I write the devotion, it is a huge responsibility. I don't take it lightly. And you have to read it and read it and read it. I can't tell you how many times, and study it and talk about it, and think about it, and pray about it, dream about it, and dreaming about the thing. And at some point, it's like it writes itself. But it's such a huge responsibility because you're talking about something that, you know, is holy. It's holy. And it's a huge weight.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm constantly you're pulling out metaphors and you just can't imagine. I don't know how you wrote the sermon. I have a clue. The responsibility, how you teach this class.
Oh,
I mean, really, how long does it take and then to write it up and choose the parable and it's just huge because you affect lives.
it keeps me alive. It does. And I'd like to thank you for the privilege of doing it and for your attention. Because I gotta tell you that I wanted to be an Old Testament scholar teaching in college. The Lord pushed me where he pushed me. This allows me to do what I originally wanted to do.
That's great, thank goodness for us,
To teach,
Teach.
to be a professor. An Old Testament, wow, yeah.
And Old Testament is my passion.
and we made you go to the new. Sorry.
Well, being a preacher forces you to the New Testament. Yeah. And, I'm, I have obviously a scholarly bent. But I'm no longer a scholar, not current. Scholarship changes. And some stuff is coming up that I realize is new that I didn't know anything about. And I keep reading about it, and so I keep expanding my mind, by learning. And the thing about it is as a pastor, you're very busy. And you really can't put the time into hearing the sermon as you'd like. There are some pastors, some churches where the pastor is primarily a preaching pastor
Yeah.
and doesn't do anything else except prepare a sermon each week, or does very little else. I was at Calvary where you're a solo pastor and you do everything else. So that's if you want to be, the hardest way to be a pastor is to be a solo pastor. That is hard.
There again, please.
The hardest way to be a pastor is to be a solo pastor. It's also the hardest way to be an attorney, which I was, a solo practice, so. Cause you just, I never felt that I had really had the time I needed. I do now, and I really cherish it. Time. I can spend about as much or as little time as I need to. And how much time does it take? Well, it depends. I spend less time preparing for the class in the parables because all I do is do the background stuff. And so that you have something to start with. When I'm teaching other things, I have to spend more time up front to prepare the class. On the other hand, I think I may spend more time writing email than
Oh,
I
yeah, that's-
ordinarily would,
That
because,
is really.
because yeah, I can just go from my
Summarizing.
notes to write the email before, so what I do is watch it. I go back and watch the class.
Oh, that's good.
I originally tried to keep notes during the class, and for a while there, I was printing out, it's possible to print out the script, but I find it's better and easier just to watch the class for an hour and take notes as I watch, so that I can pick up your wisdom. 'Cause your wisdom is really driving it.
When I said it must be frustrating for a minister to look at his congregation and know what he's trying to tell them, what he's trying, and realizing that most of them aren't listening or aren't gonna follow through, must be like a parent trying to teach a child something that the child simply doesn't get.
Yeah.
And you think, how else can I do this? It's important to me, it's so important to know, and then they won't listen.
Yeah,
That's the frustration I'm talking about.
and that's when things get stressful when you're a parent. I can remember telling my kids, "Just look at me when I'm talking to you."
It's the shutter,
Uh,
it's the shutter rule. You got 3 seconds before the ear shutters go.
It,
Sentence.
Um,
what I found is that the best way to handle that is to try different styles of preaching and different Sundays, stuff like that. Now and then I would just tell a story. Uh, I had stories from nothing but a story. And sometimes those are the ones that people really remember.
Those are parables.
Right, that's parable, yeah. And sometimes it's, well, I come into this class with different strategies for different passages sometimes. And so that's my responsibility, to try to communicate what scripture says in a way that people can hear it. That's my responsibility, and which I try to do. Okay, thank you, folks. We'll see you next week. Happy Lent.
Wait, do you know what we're gonna do next week, Fred?
Nope,
Okay.
nope, don't know yet.
No,